A Schranz track that has everything: an incredibly saturated kick drum, an even more noisy percussion, and emotional synthesizer melodies. How to produce Schranz from scratch to mastering like those two guys that worked with legends like Obi? Today you will learn making rumble without reverb, rhythmic vocal chops, creating that characteristic whoosh sound with just noise, and synthesizing in Serum a melodic lead and the Reese bass. In the arrangement section of this tutorial, I will focus most on the track structure and making percussion stutter effects. With the ill-formed Glitch 2 plugin, high and low pass filters and Ableton's beat repeat effect. From mixing, you will learn the necessary parallel processing techniques for a full Schranz percussion and sidechaining the rumble by tucking only low frequencies. For more glue between the kick and bass, we will wrap this video up with the mastering section that will show you what it takes to make the track release ready. Visit my website to listen to the full track, to download the whole project and to learn about my techno production lessons for both beginner and intermediate producers. Let's start the tutorial now with creating the kick and rumble. Making the kick drum in style of Noise Not War is surprisingly easier in comparison with other Schranz kicks, as their kicks are relatively short and focus mostly on the click and transient. It's no surprise that even such kicks will require layering, that is combining best parts of a few kick samples to end up with a single powerful sound, but here it really takes a simple form. I will need just 3 samples, out of which the first one will give the kick all the punch in the low end, and that punch is what you want to focus on most when choosing the kick sample. What exactly this punch should sound like? A simple check when when choosing kicks for punch is listening to them with a low pass filter on. Use on a kick the auto filter and set it to a low pass filter with moderate slope and the cutoff at 150 Hz. Play the kick through it. And if you will hear that the kick is not flat and the fat low end fades out slowly, you've most likely found a great kick. If you listen to the same kick without the low pass filter and you still like the sample, feel free to use it as the main kick for your track. Alternatively, just download the Arachne free sample pack from Lobcold. Nearly all one-shot kicks from that pack are punchy as you need and pass the low pass filter check I've just shown you. The main kick should be around 150mm short. The sample I'm using here is just a bit longer than that, so I will trim the kick. And if after trimming it I hear an unpleasant click in the end, I add a few milliseconds of fade out to fix that. I drop the pitch by 1 semitone, which is optional, and I bring down the sample volume to -27 decibels. I'm doing that so when the kick gets tons of saturation and equalization later, my mixer channels will be still green, making the mixdown of the track a breeze. On top of this main kick, I will add 2 more samples that only have a purpose of giving more click and power in both mid and high frequencies. This effectively will make the whole kick rich and powerful. When choosing these 2 kick samples, I focused only on the way they sound like in the beginning. For example, this kick has an interesting click in the mid-range, and that one sounds like it has a tiny hi-hat on top, so I know this kick will fill the high end greatly. These both samples will become my kick layers. The way I process kick layers is following. At first, I quickly set a high pass filter at 200 Hz. It doesn't matter what EQ plugin you use, as long as it has a rather steep high-pass filter. We are talking about filters with a slope that ranges from 24 decibels per octave up to filters with 48 decibels per octave. For kick layering, I don't use filters with lower slope, as they don't remove the low end precisely enough. I also don't use more aggressive filters because they can make the whole kick sound weird afterwards, not to mention adding unnecessary phase shifts that could result in kick post-ringing. Set the filter up like that and then play both main kick and the kick layer you will adjust. Make sure the kick layer is loud enough so you can hear all the adjustments you are doing. The reason for why I keep the main kick playing in the background is that it helps me to hear immediately what does the whole kick will sound like with the kick layer. Start with changing the sample pitch until you feel like the kick layer sits well with the main one. From my experience, I changed the pitch of kick layers just by 1 or 2 semitones, nothing extreme. Then, shorten the kick. If you keep the layer as long as the main kick, which is, just to remind, 150 milliseconds, you will add more mid and high frequencies to the whole kick, but my goal is to only enhance the click/transient of the kick. If so, then I shorten the kick layer to around 50 milliseconds. Again, I add some fade out to get rid of unpleasant clicks. Now, return to the equalizer and readjust the high pass filter. It will influence a lot the way your whole kick sounds like. Not only you can set a different slope, as long as it's in my personally recommended range, but depending on whether you want to add more or less mids to the kick, you can move the cutoff frequency higher or lower. Once the high pass filter is alright, I like to try trimming the kick just a bit from the left side as well. This will change the relative position of two kick samples and can influence slightly the kick transient. Sometimes this small trick just works. At last, adjust the volume of the kick layer. There isn't any specific volume value I can recommend. I just try to blend the kick layer with the main one, so when I turn on and off the kick layer, the whole kick still sounds natural. In the exact same way, I process the second kick layer that enhances the kick transient more. Now, you might ask why I have here 2 kick layers instead of, for example, 1 or 4. How do I know how many layers are enough? The answer is simple. Notice that after adjusting the volume of the second layer, toggling this layer on and off doesn't contribute to the whole kick as much as the first kick layer. You could say that's just because the second kick layer is too quiet, but if I increase the volume of it, the kick seems too bright. Which is something I don't want. So, to sum up, the second kick layer doesn't need to be louder and it already changes the kick just slightly when I turn this sound on and off. If so, then we can imagine adding a third kick layer is not worth the effort at all, as its influence over the whole kick will be basically none. The kick in the group processing, where I process all 3 samples at once, is mostly just equalized. But the way I equalize this kick will depend on other sounds in the track I didn't create yet, so let's move on to the rumble sound now. But before that, let me just say again that if you want to learn techno production fast in a simple way, without browsing YouTube and Reddit for hours, visit my website to learn about my private music production lessons. Schedule a free consultation call, discuss the lessons with me and buy them with a discount. The rumble will be made out of the same kick we used for punch. I'm using this sample. Once again, in the MIDI clip for both kick and rumble, I played the future rumble sound in 1/16th pattern, the same pattern you usually use in rolling bass lines. From the kick drum, you essentially need to remove the transient part, and you need to soften the kick further to create a simple rumble sound. As usual, I add a bit of fade out, and then I drop the pitch of the sample to make the rumble deeper. How do I know when the rumble is pitched down enough? If you look at the rumble through Vox & Co Span or any other frequency spectrum analyzer, but Span is one of the best plugins for that, you will see the rumble peaks at around 65 Hz. And this, in my opinion, is the upper limit of the frequency range I want the rumble bass to dominate. This means I can leave the pitch of the rumble as it is, but I can also pitch the sample lower as long as it dominates the right frequency range. For Schranz, let's say that this frequency range is equal from 50 to 65 Hz, but if you want to learn more about proper frequency ranges for the low end, then this tutorial that explains and fixes all common rumble mistakes has all the answers you need. The rumble needs a lot of saturation right after the simpler. There are 2 reasons for using that saturation. The first one is the waveform. Right now, as you can see and hear, the rumble is very rhythmic and it bounces a lot. Heavy saturation will make the rumble flat and the low end of the whole beat will become consistent. That is mandatory if you want to get a powerful Schranz beat. The second reason is that saturation as well as distortion adds more frequency content to the rumble. Let's look again at the rumble through Vox & Co Span. It's important to have in rumble lots of frequency content from roughly 100 to 200 Hz. My unprocessed rumble has little of such frequencies, and our goal is to make that frequency range that full. It goes without saying that this rumble sounds much fuller. To achieve that, plenty of saturation is needed. I'm using 3 distortion effects, one after another. Let me clarify, it's not required to always saturate the rumble with 3 different plugins as I did here. The reason for why I have 3 distortion effects here is that at first I used the decapitator alone, and I thought the rumble is good enough. Later, when making the track, I added percussion, and I noticed the rumble was very empty, so I added the roar effect. In the end, when making final touches to the mix, I decided to throw in the third distortion effect instead of, for example, readjusting the roar effect. Many other distortion effects would work here equally well. It doesn't matter much whether you use here the Isotope Trash 2, Arturia Dist Coldfire or newfangled Saturate. As long as you fill that 100 to 200 Hz frequency range as well you've seen a minute ago. The number of distortion plugins used here, the amount of distortion coming from them. The distortion plugins you decide to use are going to mostly shape the tone of the rumble. The more experience you have, the better you can control that, and chaining distortion effects in series is a rather advanced production technique. Okay, with that said, let's listen once again to the rumble with and without all the distortion, to understand how heavy the saturation on rumble has to be. As always, the rumble has to be sidechained to the kick drum. The reason for that is so the low frequencies from the rumble don't clash with the low end of the kick. If we let this happen, the kick loses the punch and the beat is not full of energy. Usually, sidechaining the rumble is as easy as throwing the LFO tool on the rumble and automating the volume of it, so the sound quickly fades in once the kick stops to play. This is what I exactly did in the full VZSPAC style track tutorial to sidechain the rumble to the kick. Listen to the kick and rumble with and without the LFO tool. We can hear that sidechain adds a nice pump, making the beat rhythmic. However, if I come back to the master channel to turn on the low pass filter again, you will hear better how does sidechain keep the kick drum punchy. Okay, you should already understand the purpose and the effect of using sidechain, so let's focus on a small problem with the LFO tool here. This plugin makes the whole rumble dark. Both low and mid frequencies are affected. Because of that, the kick is glued to the rumble less than it could theoretically be. If your Schranz beat needs even more glue, which isn't always necessary, sometimes you want the beat to be more pumping instead of glued, then let's take a look at another approach to sidechain compression. Add to the rumble an equalizer. I'm using here the Pro Q4 by Fab filter and add a low shelf filter. With enough attenuation and the cutoff hovering at around 130 Hz, the rumble has all the low end cut. Now we just need to automate the gain knob in the equalizer to make the low end muted whenever the kick plays, but once the kick stops playing, the gain is brought back to 0 decibels. To automate the gain knob, I use Ableton's Shaper. This effect creates an adjustable modulation curve I can attach to nearly everything. Just click the map button and then click the parameter you want to control. Now I will try to do the same for the low shelf filter's gain. Whenever stuff like this happens, where you can't add the modulation to a knob inside of a plugin, do the following. Expand the plugin tile by clicking this arrow and then click the configure button. Once the button is highlighted, click a knob or fader in the plugin you want to automate. A slider below the configure button should appear. Click the configure once more and now use the map button in the shaper to control the fader you just added. The automation is added, so let's tweak it. At first, look at these two numbers. They control the modulation range for the gain knob in the Pro Q. To sidechain only the low end of the kick, you want to set the first number to 50%, which translates to no attenuation, and the second one to 0%, which equals to maximum attenuation on the shelf filter. Now create the modulation curve. In the beginning, we want the low end to disappear, and later we bring it back. The shape you create in the shaper effect will control the rhythm of the low end, so it will tell how fast and aggressive does the low end come back. You will need to adjust it with respect to the kick sound, because kick drums can be, for example, shorter or longer. What I personally did is I turned back the low pass filter on the master channel and tweaked the sidechain rhythm in the shaper. By isolating the low end, it was easier to hear what I'm doing. Once the rhythm was good, I turned the auto filter off and went back to Pro Q4 to adjust the cutoff frequency and the low show filter shape. The shape of the filter is adjusted with both filter slope and Q knob that I adjust to whatever sounds better. From my experience, this means the filter slope ranges from 12 dB to 24 dB per octave, and the Q ranges from 0.8 to 1.8. The cutoff frequency tells how many frequencies are cut from the rumble in the beginning. I will recommend leaving it in the range from 110 Hz to maybe even 250 Hz, depending on what sounds better. This sidechain technique is more complex than just using the LFO tool, but now if I compare the difference in the sound, you can see that ducking only the low end gives a sound that's glued much better. In the end, I add a few decibels to the rumble volume, and both kick and rumble are ready for mixing and group processing. I will show you later in the mixing part of this tutorial. Right now, let's make the percussion. Percussion in Schranz is, in my opinion, one of the most difficult sounds to create in harder styles of techno. It's more or less as difficult as making an industrial techno kick from scratch. The percussion is made out of many different sounds and rhythms. In my project, I have a whoosh sound, layered percussion loops, a few noise layers, a clap, a closed hi-hat, a ride sound, and a percussion one-shot sound effect. Most of these sounds are distorted and compressed heavily to give an impression of a noisy and cluttered percussion. At the same time, these sounds are heavily equalized, which is necessary to keep the mix clean. At the end, all the sounds might be grouped together to undergo extra processing, where I will definitely include equalization to clean up the percussion from harsh frequencies. Let's start with creating the whoosh sound. Some Schranz tutorials, including probably a few of my older tutorials, will tell you to make such sound by getting a few percussion loops and using on them a lot of distortion and sidechain compression. However, there is a simpler way to make a whoosh sound. On a new MIDI channel, I'm using Serum 2 synthesizer. In the OSC tab, turn everything off and leave only the noise oscillator on. Create a simple MIDI clip that plays a note every single beat. Before I fine-tune the sound of the noise, I will add the LFO tool plugin you have already seen me using in the previous chapter when I covered ways to sidechain the rumble. This LFO tool will make the whoosh pumping. I will keep the rumble playing in background so it's easier to hear how the whoosh will fill the whole beat. Return to Serum 2 and fine-tune the noise oscillator. Start with choosing a noise sample you think sounds best. Stick to using only the anal category of noises that I recommend most. Then use the level knob to roughly adjust the whoosh volume and the pitch knob to control the tone of the noise. I will turn this knob a bit down because I want the whoosh sound to fill a lot of mid-frequencies. This is essential for a full Schranz percussion. A whoosh that sounds like this is too empty, but this kind of a whoosh sounds great. Once you set up the noise oscillator, close the serum window because we don't need to do anything more. Distort the sound right after the serum. Some could say I could just use distortion that's in serum's effects tab, but today in this project I got a better sound with stock Ableton effects. Remember when I mentioned the rumble sound distortion? I said that each distortion effect can call out the sound in a different way, and the more experienced you are, the better you can control the tone of the rumble with distortion. With the pedal effect, I'm doing essentially the same thing. I'm controlling the tone of the noise with distortion. If you will like more here, the amp, saturator or overdrive that are another effects I can recommend trying heavily, feel free to use those instead of the pedal. In the pedal effect, I have chosen a distortion style I liked most. Then, by using the gain and the sub switch, I controlled the tone of noise further. The output and the extra utility are just for making sure the whoosh of the distortion isn't louder than before. The whoosh sound is a distorted noise, which means that if I look at the frequency spectrum of it, it's going to have plenty of low ends. And as we remember from the rumble part of this tutorial, we don't want to mix low frequencies with each other. The whoosh sound also needs to be way lighter, so a high-pass filter is necessary. You can high-pass the whoosh with an equalizer like Pro Q or Ableton's EQ8. Here I'm using the Filter Freak by Soundtoys. But I have to admit that the only reason I use this plugin is so I could modulate the high-pass filter in one way or another if that would be necessary. In the end, I didn't end up modulating anything, so I have just a static high-pass filter. What's worth noticing is a large filter resonance that creates a bump around the cutoff frequency that is set to 570 Hz. I'm adding such a resonance because Schranz percussion needs to not only fill the high frequencies range, but the mid-range as well. The cutoff frequency is set to anything from around 300 to 900 Hz. We'll make sure the whoosh sound is light enough, but still has plenty of mid-frequencies to fill the mid-range. The mid-range boost makes the whoosh heavier, but another problem is that the whoosh is not bright enough. We will fix that inside the Pro Q equalizer that comes after the Filter Freak. While I have a few filters here and there, right now I want you to pay attention to that large high-shelf filter. I add 25 decibels of high frequencies boost to make the whoosh bright enough. You might think that's a lot of boost, but if you look at the frequency spectrum of the whoosh sound before the high-end boost, you will see we have little to no high-end. We have extra equalizers in this sound processing, but they don't change the sound by a lot. The plugins essentially give that small final touch, and I added these plugins when I was close to finishing the mixdown of the whole track. The second most important sound in Schranz percussion are percussion loops that will require not only layering for a fuller sound, just like we did with the kick samples, but also a lot of processing to make those loops sound very full. But let's focus at first on sample selection. The percussion and noise network tracks focuses a lot on the transients in the high-end range. What do I mean is that despite heavy compression and distortion, you will still hear a lot of clicks and ticks in higher frequencies. What does it mean in context of sample selection? To get that kind of percussion, avoid using loops from Vengeance Essential Clap Sounds packs. Loops from these packs don't have a lot of hi-hats and high frequency content. Vengeance loops often have some tiny kicks and claps here and there, which are great if you want to make Klankensler style percussion, but you have to keep in mind that the percussion and Klankensler tracks is focused more on the mid frequencies. For today's project, I will be recommending hi-hats loops from drum and bass sample packs. Most of these packs will have clicky percussion loops that will fit the style of Schranz I'm making in this project. I will use 3 different loop samples and they sound like this. I add all 3 loops to the drum rack, where I will organize all percussion sounds aside from the whoosh that is made in Serum. Drum and bass percussion loops have the tempo of 175 BPM and our Schranz track is at 155. The first thing I'm doing is synchronizing the tempo of the loops to the tempo of this Ableton project. In Simpler, turn on warping and make sure the beats algorithm is set. This Ableton feature will keep the loop synchronized to the project regardless of, for example, the pitch of the loop. Let's play the whoosh sound in the background and see how to control the rhythm of percussion loops in the Simpler. I can start with either doubling or halving the playback speed of the loop. If you want to keep the natural rhythm of the percussion though, don't use these buttons. Another interesting thing is playing the loop from a different moment. By trimming the sample from the left, I can influence the rhythm a lot. Another thing to tweak is the pitch. If you change the pitch slightly, just like when we work with kick samples, you will keep the natural sound of the percussion. But if you change the pitch up or down by a whole octave, this, combined with the warping, will give crazy results. Maybe a bit too crazy for the kind of percussion I want to make. Another thing that can make the percussion loop more crazy is using different warping modes. Every option other than beats is going to degrade the sound or make it less bright, which in case of this project is undesirable. To keep the clean sound, I will set the algorithm back to beats and leave the default setting. I did show you many simpler settings to tweak, but what I emphasized a lot is that the percussion needs to sound clean, so let me show you one more trick that can make the percussion cleaner. If you don't want to hear so much background in the percussion loop and you want to extract only the clicky parts of the sample, use on the percussion loop the gate effect. Here is a really quick guide on using it. After loading the effect, drop the return to 0 and turn down the flow to -infinity. Now look at the waveform of the loop and the blue line that is controlled with the threshold. The gate effect is going to pass through only parts of the loop that are louder than the threshold level. Depending on that threshold, you can leave only the transients of the percussion or make the loop just a bit cleaner. After setting up the threshold, you can fine-tune the gate effect rhythm with look ahead, attack, hold and release. Using this effect on percussion loops is really optional. I've made a lot of Schranz percussion sounds without the gate effect, and you can see an example of that in this tutorial where I teach making a simpler Schranz percussion in FL Studio. Just in this project, I thought I will make the percussion even more clicky by silencing the background noise. I'm going to add 2 more loops. The reason is simple, my percussion needs more clicks and ticks in the high-end range. The second percussion loop is processed in the same way as the first one. At first, I tweaked the simplest settings and then I added a bit of gate. The utility helps matching the volume level with the volume of the first percussion loop, so both loops are blended well. The third percussion loop is processed just as 2 previous ones. Notice that here I played a bit with the settings of the beats warping algorithm. This controls how does the loop get stretched. Tweaking both preserve and mode will have a slight impact on the rhythm coming from this loop. Just as before, I add the gate that is again optional and the utility to control the volume. All 3 percussion loops are played in the MIDI clip in a way you can see now. Another interesting thing you can try out is to play some of the loops twice as often. This will make certain percussion sounds more repetitive and may make the percussion even more rhythmic. Percussion patterns in Schranz are usually 1 beat long, and as you can see, the way my percussion pattern looks like reflects that. Percussion loops, just like the kick drum with rumble and other sounds we will add soon, has to be distorted to make the beat fuller. In the group processing that treats all 3 loops as a single sound, I add the roar from Ableton. Using distortion in the group processing will make sure that all percussion loops will sound more glued and coherent. I picked a distortion style that gives the percussion warmth in the mid frequencies. Again, filling the mid-range is important for a powerful Schranz percussion. Percussion loops after using the roar sound less bright, but that's something easy to fix with an equalizer. Before I equalize and sidechain these percussion loops though, I will create a few other sounds I really need. It's time to make now the noise layers. They will help filling the beat with crunchy high frequencies and noisy mid-range. I think it's best to make those noise layers out of the percussion loops we've just made. I have 2 reasons for that. The first one is that percussion loops are playing all the time. There are no silent parts in the loops, so noise layers made out of them will have constant volume. The second reason is that rhythmic loops after distortion will give rhythmic noise sounds. This will sound more interesting than a simple whoosh sound we made earlier. That is just a sidechained noise with some fuzz. To create noise layers out of percussion loops right after the roar effect, I use the audio effect track. It will split the sound into as many processing chains as I create, so we are doing parallel processing. The first chain is going to be called dry, where in theory no processing will happen, but later you will see me adding slight distortion and equalization here. In the second chain, called noise, I will create a noise layer with lots of heavy mid frequencies. The Synth chain, called Comp, will use the Soundtoys Devil Lock Deluxe plugin you could see me glazing in another tutorial for industrial techno percussion. Devil Lock will compress the hi-hats heavily and give a bright noise full of high-end. Let's start with the mid-range noise. I said previously that with enough experience, you can control the tone of the sound using distortion. This roughly means you will know what distortion effects are going to make the sound either darker or brighter or whatever. Let's see an example of that. If I want to create noise that's heavy in the mid-range, one of the best distortion effects to use is the amp from Ableton. It has 7 distortion styles to choose from, and they all simulate guitar amplifiers. Out of those 7 styles, usually the heavy one gives the darkest sound full of low mids. Once you choose the distortion style, add a lot of distortion with the gain knob. Really, you can completely trash the sound here, as long as you find the right kind of tone for the noise. Later, these 4 controls are supposed to work like a simple equalizer, but sometimes they either do nothing or they only change the way the distortion and crunch sounds like. So I just adjust them according to my taste and equalize the noise properly later. Dry wet stays at 100% because we are using this effect inside the audio effect track. Volume knob can be touched to either control the output volume or to fine-tune the distortion tone, and that behavior depends on the distortion style chosen. I will say one more thing about the amp effect that's pretty important here. I set the output type to mono in the amp effect for a purpose. Percussion and Schranz should be in the center a lot. If I keep most of the percussion in mono, and this especially relates to noisy sounds like the one I'm doing here, it will sound more solid than having that noise spread out in stereo. Let me show you the difference right now. We can hear that the amp added a lot of mid-range, but it also added some high-end crunch that I'm not a fan of. I imagine the high-end crunch to sound different, maybe less aggressive, and that's what I will create in the comp chain in the audio effect track. So right after the amp I add an equalizer. A low-pass filter will remove that undesirable high-end crunch, and the high-pass filter will make this sound lighter and prevent the low end from overlapping. The noise is incredibly loud, so let's turn the volume down and move on to creating the high-end fuzz. In this chain I'm using mainly the Devil Lock Deluxe compressor. It has 2 main knobs that add different flavors of noise and compression. Because it's a compression plugin, it also has a release setting that here, fortunately, is just a single switch. If you want the compressor to work more aggressive to flatten the sound more, always choose a faster release over the slower one. The darkness knob cuts the high end out of the output. Since this chain has to give the high end fuzz, it's obvious I'm not going to need to use this knob, and the mix stays at 10 because of this effect being in parallel processing. So I just need to tweak both crush and crunch to find the tone of the noise I like, and afterwards I use the utility to bring down the output volume so I can show you better the before and after difference in sound. The Devil Lock compressed the percussion heavily, but despite that I still don't have that fried high frequency fuzz. I know 2 Ableton effects that can fix that: erosion and vinyl distortion that I will use here. Vinyl distortion is an effect I also used and explained in my previous VZASBAC full track tutorial, so if you are interested in how does this effect work, refer to that video or read the Ableton manual, that is one of the best learning resources. In this video I will just toggle on and off the effect to show you what exactly I mean by adding that high frequency fuzz to the percussion. After the vinyl distortion, I again tweak the volume of the noise layer and equalize it. Here the Pro Q4 mainly cuts the low end with an additional boost in the mid-range, but this shell filter won't change the fact this noise layer focuses heavily on the high frequencies. And now, a surprise, an extra distortion on the dry channel, where I expected to not use any processing. But when I was mixing this track, I discovered that my percussion is not crushed and compressed enough to make it sound as driving as in the reference track, which was the Radio Freak. So I had to return to this part of the project to throw here the pedal effect. that still works much less aggressive than either amp or devil lock from other processing chains. These three equalizers treat the high frequencies range. I did explain in my previous tutorial the reason for using these EQ plugins that either simulate analog equalizers or just are not as precise and digital like the Pro Q form. Both SIEQ from Soundtoys and Trident A range from Softtube have less usual EQ filter shapes which, when used properly, can color the sound in a more interesting way than just the Pro Q. So usually I use these filters to color the sound with shelf filters. As you can hear, these shelf filters brighten the percussion, but then I use the Pro Q to precisely tame some harsh high frequencies to make the sound less annoying. In the end, I reduced the volume a bit. These equalizers and utility were set up during the final stages of the track Mixdown. Without hearing the rest of the sounds and without knowing how the percussion should sit in the mix, making such subtle adjustments it's pretty pointless. To wrap up the noise layers creation, let's play the dry chain in solo and then I will add both noise layers so you can understand more how we fill up the percussion. In sounds layering, that's very important. If each processing chain sounded either the same or very similar, layering not only would be less effective, it would basically make no sense. Right after the audio effect track, I add the LFO tool for sidechain. I want to point out something interesting here. This fader acts as a dry-wet fade for the volume automation. Instead of leaving it at 100%, I set it to 83%. Thanks to that, the noise is not completely muted in the beginning of each beat when the kick plays, and that's supposed to make the beat sound fuller. Let's play the kick and I will show you what do I mean. The next percussion sound we are making is a one-shot sound effect I will play from time to time. It's made out of another drum and bass percussion loop that I processed in simpler and the same way as those 3 loops you've seen me working on earlier. The difference is that this loop will not be playing constantly, but from time to time to create a nice rhythm with the clap sound we don't have yet. To make this sound stand out from previous loops, I brought down the pitch by 2 octaves. If I didn't do that, then what could happen is that this sound would drown among distorted and compressed loops. This percussion one-shot needs to be louder and much brighter. A simple high shelf filter in the Pro Q will fix that. After that, I add a tiny bit of distortion. Adding lots of distortion would make this one-shot similar to previous percussion sounds, and I want to avoid that. The dynamic tube here is enough. Because the influence this plugin has over the sound is little, I will not bother with explaining how does the dynamic tube work. I will just say that, instead of it, what would also work great and give a similar sound is a bit crusher plugin like Ableton's Redux or D16 Decimod 2. If I play this one shot with other sounds, you can feel that the one shot is dry and doesn't have enough space. Previous percussion sounds didn't use any reverb, so using a reverb here is an idea worth trying out. I like to use reverb in parallel processing. For example, it lets me to equalize the reverbs separately, which is very helpful if the reverbs are large and long. Here for the one shot I will use a short reverb, but the audio effect track will let me comfortably adjust the volume levels of both dry and wet signal. When working with reverb, I avoid relying on the dry-wet knob. The dry chain has just an utility that turns down the volume, but the reverb one uses the native flex swap by SSL. I find this reverb working great on percussion sounds. It doesn't sound unnatural, unlike the reverb from Serum Effects. It also sounds smooth even if the reverb length is set to around 1 second, which is something I can't achieve with plugins like Convolution XT or Ableton's Hybrid Reverb. What happens inside of this plugin? I start with choosing the reverb type that fits the beat best. Then I tweak the size. This control is in nearly all reverb plugins and has a big impact over the reverb character. All the faders that are useful here are the diffusion and blend. The blend controls whether the reverb is a sound that explodes in the beginning with a lot of reverberation, or is a smooth sound that gives mostly the background. Every other fader here gives the sound little impact, and I just tweak them however I like. The reverb length stays very short, below 1 second. This reverb is not supposed to give the percussion a lot of space. Percussion in Schranz is not spacious and wide. I'm using the reverb here, so the sound is not completely dry. The whole EQ section to the right is turned off, so the effect is much simpler to use. I turn down the volume with utility, and let's hear the difference in sound. After the reverb, there is some extra processing applied to this percussion one-shot, but this belongs rather to the mixdown and not sound design, so let's skip it for now and take a look at ride samples. Even ride samples can be layered for either fuller or more interesting sound. In this project, I wanted a ride sample with a nice transient because again, I want a lot of clicks and ticks in the percussion, while this sample has that click, it's not so full in the mid-range. Because of that, I added the second sample that sounds like it's pitched lower than the first one. The second ride sample has slightly tamed highs, and again, this is something that belongs to the final mixing touches, not to the sound design. After tweaking the volume in the utility, I can process both sounds as one. Ride samples in Schranz are extremely compressed and sidechained. I start with Brainworks compressor that essentially needs only 3 controls to be tweaked. The speed knob acts as a both attack and release in any other compressor plugin. Turning the speed up will make the compression more flat and aggressive, just like when we have been trying out different release settings in the Devil Lock compressor. Peak reduction tells the amount of compression, and output compensates any difference in volume. Instead of Brainworks Opto, you can use a limiter like Ableton's limiter or D16 Frontier I love as well. The differences between these plugins will be in the rhythm the compression adds to the right samples. Why I didn't use the Devil Lock that worked great on percussion loops? The Devil Lock usually adds to the compression extra fuzz and distortion that I don't need on my right samples. The Brainworks Opto will keep the sound clean. The second important effect for rides is sidechain. You can see the rhythm in this LFO tool plugin is way different from the rhythms I made earlier. As I said, Schranz percussion can be very complex and needs various rhythms to sound interesting. Also, the right samples need to be very loud in the beat. Let's add almost 5 decibels of gain. And later we will hear why this was so important. The second last sound in my percussion is the clap. It's made out of 3 samples. The first 2 samples give the clap a nice body. And the third one adds a nice high frequency click, mainly thanks to me pitching the sample up by 11 semitones. All 3 samples individually have only volume levels adjusted, and in the group processing, I also start with making sure the clap is very loud in the mix. I would say that on average I want the clap sound to be louder than percussion loops, but just a bit quieter than the right sample. Notice the clap is quite noisy, so it already has some high ends. Because of that, I will use these 2 equalizers here to bump up the mid-range, which will give claps more presence in the mix. The last sound in the Schranz percussion is a closed offbeat hi-hat. Just like the right sound, the closed hi-hat is made out of 2 different samples. The second hi-hat has only the utility to adjust the volume, but the first one, aside from the utility, has the D16 Frontier limiter on. It might sound funny to use a limiter on a single hi-hat sample, but I need this closed hi-hat to be hearable well in the mix. Aside from the amount of compression I add through the threshold, notice again a fast release setting. Again, the goal is to make the compression more aggressive. Both hi-hat samples are grouped, but here I use only the utility to adjust the volume and stereo width. All these individual sounds in the drum rack got a lot of effects and processing added. Thanks to that, the group processing becomes proportionally easier. In the Loops plus Hats channel I have just a single equalizer, but if I group the loops, hi-hats and whoosh sound together, then on that group I can add more equalization that will balance the frequencies most. This group equalization is something you will hear in action later when I will be mixing down the track. Now let's create the main lead sound. Fortunately, this lead is much simpler than the percussion that I guess will become a large part of this tutorial. I will start with pointing out that in the Radio Freak track by Noise Not War, the synthesizers are crispy and sharp. This essentially means two things. I can't use a lot of effects like unison, detune, chorus, hyperdimension and reverb, and it would be great to distort slightly the synthesizer somewhere. In Serum I will start with the first oscillator. Use here the simplest and most basic waveforms, sawtooth waves and square waves. That sounds sharp and give a full range of frequencies. I like the sound of this basic MG wavetable that, after tweaking the wavetable position, reminds slightly a square wave. The melody I wrote is simple and without chords. Playing chords would quickly make this lead sound too detuned, and as a result, the lead wouldn't be sharp. On the first oscillator, I added a bit of movement with unisono detune. I know, I said a while ago I can't use a lot of such effects, so that's why I use only 4 unison voices and the detune is set to 12 o'clock. And usually, when I make leads or screeches, the detune knob can hover at around 2 o'clock. As you could hear, the difference the unisono detune gives is relatively small and that's great. Additionally, I added extra warping to further control the waveform you see in this window. The waveform is warped for the first time with the flip. And then I use amplitude modulation where the oscillator B is the source. What you load into the warping slots is really subjective. I would say you could use here nearly everything except the FM and PD. That would immediately sound too aggressive, making the lead too metallic, and distortion, because we will use some distortion on the whole synths outside of Serum. One thing I did to make the lead more interesting is I added more rhythms through the volume envelope. I adjusted the first envelope that by default controls the volume of all oscillators in Serum, so the sound gets gradually turned down in volume. After around 0.6 seconds, the lead will stay at the volume of around -12 decibels. Listen to how this lead sounds like with and without that envelope. If I can't play chords or use a lot of unisono detune, then how do I make this lead sound full? The answer is adding more oscillators. The second oscillator is a square wave which shape I designed again through both wavetable position and warping to make the sound fit the oscillator A best. Pay attention to the pitch. Pitching down this oscillator by 2 octaves will make the synths much heavier and fuller than if I left this control untouched. This oscillator does not use any unison detune. Not only I added enough detune on to the first one, but adding any detune to lower frequencies would stop the lead being that heavy and in center. Let's see a quick example of that. To make sure the lower frequencies of the lead dominate enough, I made the second oscillator a bit louder than the first one. Following the same principle of adding more oscillators with different pitch, at last I add the oscillator C. Again, to keep the lead simple, I use no detune. This oscillator is the quietest one, meaning that after adding it, there is no point in trying to play around in the oscillator tab more because the synthesizer is already as rich as I need. That's the whole Serum preset. We can close the window to add processing that is almost mandatory for lead synths. For convenience, I add that processing in the audio effect track for parallel processing. The dry chain has only the utility to adjust the volume. The reverb chain will use Serum's whole reverb. As I said, reverb in Serum isn't very natural, and while it doesn't fit percussion most, on some synthesizers works actually great. Especially the whole reverb type is something I like to use on synths. The reverb has large size and moderate lengths to make sure the lead will be spacious enough. There's a tiny bit of spin added to give the reverb slight modulation, and while the high cut is used here roughly, it's the Pro Q equalizer that fine-tunes the amount of high end in the reverb. So, the high shelf filter controls the balance of mid and high frequencies. And these two filters clean up the reverb so it fits in the mix better. The reverb is made quieter but wider to enhance the sense of space. The second effect I use is the delay. That is used to enhance the rhythm of the lead. I don't need any confusion or complex rhythm here, so I give both left and right channels the same delay time and quite low feedback to not have so much echo. No filter is needed. One thing to note is that the delay is turned down in volume more than the reverb. That's because I shouldn't try to make both effects as important. If I plan to use mainly the reverb, the delay has to be more in the background and vice versa. If my main effect is the delay, it's the reverb that has to be quieter. This is something I also covered in my short tutorial with 5 sound design tricks for leads that covers other important things to know if you want to create powerful synths. Right after the audio effect track, the group processing begins. I start with subtle distortion coming from the Camel Crusher plugin. I'm using a lot of tube distortion that works great on many synthesizers, including bass sounds. In case of the Camel Crusher, you can also use the compressor module with fat mode enabled that greatly enhances the tube distortion module. The amount of distortion added is large enough to give the synths a slight crisp, but that crisp is quiet, thanks to me using the mix knob. The effect that comes after the Camel Crusher is the soft tube Drummer S7 III. You've already seen me using it in the VZS Pack Full tutorial, where I explained that I use this plugin mainly as a way to color a sound in a way I can't with an equalizer. I want to give the sound more shine, so I'm using the Clarity Tool style setting, but without the air switch on, that would add too much unnecessary hiss. The second reason for why I'm using this plugin is to glue more the synths with reverb and delay I have in the audio effect track. The distortion I have here adds some glue as well. In case you don't know, distortion also reduces the dynamic range, just like a compressor or a limiter. But unlike the Camel Crusher, the Drummer S7 III adds more glue without adding more crackle or crunch. Let's listen to the difference in sound. Despite using the Clarity Tool setting in the Drummer S7 III, I still want the lead to be brighter. To do that without adding more compression, that I don't need, I use now the equalizer. The SIEQ by Sound Toys will add brightness at 5.6 kHz. And the Trident A range will mostly turn down both mid-range and low-end, making the sound brighter and lighter. We also have the Pro Q at the end, but this equalizes the lead more precisely, and this is something I can adjust only when I have all sounds ready for mixing. Vocal chops are used incredibly often in Schranz, and sometimes they appear in Noise Network tracks too. It's essential to use for vocal chops high quality, clean samples as fixing bad quality ones. Not only is difficult, but is also not so effective. Where to get good vocal samples from? Your best bet would be to use Splice and type the rap vocals. Look for vocals that have the BPM that's either the same or a bit lower than the BPM of your track. My Schranz track is at 155 BPM, and I would say that vocal samples from 140 to 155 BPM range would be completely safe to use. Using vocals quote-unquote slower than your project will just make Ableton speed up the vocals slightly. This will still sound natural and won't add to the sound any weird glitches, unlike when you use a vocal with a BPM faster than the BPM of your track. You can also experiment with vocal samples with the tempo of around 70 BPM, but as soon as you drop the samples into Ableton, you will have to use the half original tempo button in either the clip settings if you drop the sample onto a new audio channel, or in the Simpler if you load the vocals in Simpler. This will make Ableton play the vocals twice as fast, but with warping on, you will keep the desired pitch. I'm going to use these vocals.
40 live, we don't waste time, hit them with the rhythm in the face, push them way back, take that.
They sound very clean and will require little processing. The vocals have the tempo of 140 BPM, so to synchronize them with my track, I have to pitch them up a bit. Without warping on, pitching the sample will also change its duration. I manually tweak the pitch until I hear the vocals are synchronized with the metronome I can use for just a second.
40 live, we don't waste time, hit them with the rhythm in the face, push them way back, take that.
What will be the most important is chopping the vocals and arranging a nice rhythm. It's very simple, but it just takes some time to chop the sample in the right moments and sequence them to create a desired rhythm. For chops, I focus most on using parts with K, B, T, D letters spoken, as these parts carry a lot of power. But if I find other small parts that also sound interesting, I don't hesitate to use them as well. From this vocal sample, I will cut out 4 different parts.
40 live, we don't waste time, hit them with the rhythm in the face, way back, take that. Time. Way back.
Those chops can be tweaked further. Small chops, like the green one here, can be reversed. But the same trick won't work well on larger ones.
Time. Mouse. Time.
You can also try pitching up or down the chops. If you want to do that, I recommend to change the pitch slightly, so by 2 or 3 semitones at most, with warping off to keep the sound as natural as possible.
Time.
In my project, I didn't change the pitch and I didn't reverse any of these 4 chops. I'm playing all chops with the same volume to be sure everything will be hearable well. My track plays chops in 2 patterns. The first one is very simple and has most of the chops muted. This pattern is used in the first part of the track before the main breakdown.
Back.
From the breakdown and the second drop, I played the full pattern with all the chops I sequenced. Vocal chops that sound that clean essentially need only some reverb and equalization, but I was thinking of making the vocals slightly distorted to give them character. After a quick volume adjustment, I used the amp once again. This time I adjusted the effect to add some high-end crisp. The rock distortion style usually works great for that. I also turn up the highs slightly in the EQ section of the amp. The vocal sample I'm using is a mono sound, so here the output setting won't change anything. As I said, the amp is a very aggressive effect, so not only I lowered the gain to add less distortion, I also turned down the dry width to blend the effect nicely. After another utility, I add reverb on vocals. I was surprised to find the serum reverb I used on the main lead sound fitting vocals that good. I also tried to use on vocals the reverb from the SSL plugin, but it sounded too natural and wasn't interesting at all. The reverb settings are identical to the ones I used earlier. The vocals, just like the percussion one-shot effect, doesn't need any space. I just don't want the vocals to sound completely dry. That's why the reverb volume is turned down by so much. To make the reverb even less noticeable, I use here the Pro Q to low pass it. This reverb from Serum gives me a lot of high-end, so taming it like that is reasonable. At the same time, a high pass filter will make the reverb lighter. The amp effect I added earlier usually likes to add to the sound harsh frequencies in large amounts, so because of that, equalization will need to be more intense. Right now I will only cut the harsh high end coming from the amp with this equalizer. But later, when I will be mixing down the track, I will make a few more precise adjustments. Schranz tracks also use often a Reese bass. Such sounds are simple to make in Serum, and in the projects from beginners that learn from me during techno production lessons you can, once again, find more about on my trulymusic.com website. I see those producers add way too many effects than necessary. Let's start with a Serum preset. Just like with the main lead sound, the effects tab will be empty, so we can focus only on what happens in the OSC tab. And honestly speaking, what do you see here is not so much different from what you saw in the main lead preset. The biggest difference is that the volume envelope is flat to keep the bass volume fixed. Instead of using 3 oscillators, I use only 2, but that's not that much different. If you remember how I made the main lead sound, you know that the said oscillator I added there changed the sound subtly. What about the remaining oscillators? For Reese sounds, I also use simple waveforms that remind sawtooth or square waves. In fact, the oscillator A has the most basic sawtooth wave loaded. Once again, to make the sound modulated, I add a bit of unison detune, and the second oscillator is pitched down by an octave. If I didn't do that and played the bass without changing the pitch, the sound would be slightly less full. And that's the whole Reese bass preset. Now a fun fact. If I play a higher note on this sound and make the volume envelope look similar to what I did for the main lead, this synth wouldn't be that different from the main lead. What about the bass processing? Another problem beginner producers face when working with Reese bass sounds in techno is that the Reese isn't upfront in the mix. That's why it's so important to make sure the bass is loud enough. What you can do after adjusting the bass volume is playing your track for a second in mono. For that, I just drag the utility onto the master channel and I hit the mono switch. In that way, check if the bass is still hearable well. If the bass in mono sounds okay, but when you play your track in stereo you still feel like the bass isn't upfront enough, increase the bass stereo width. That's what I do with the second utility here. Sidechain compression is very helpful as well. Not only the beat gets more rhythmic because of extra pumping added, but the kick also has more space in the mix and the punch of that kick doesn't have to compete with the Reese bass. For breakdown that will introduce the main lead, I want another bass sound. The Reese bass would sound too aggressive here, so I decided to keep the bass line, but use it on a different Serum preset. Essentially, the main part of the second bass is a square wave that I warped to give it a different tone. I wanted the bass to be painfully simple, that's why I never used any unison detune. To that square wave I add a second oscillator. By choosing a proper wavetable, adjusting the wavetable position and using a bit of warping, I made a quiet sound that I mix with the square wave. Notice that I still give each oscillator a different pitch. Here the pitch difference between these two oscillators are 2 octaves. One last tip I can give you is that if you use more than a single oscillator and neither of them uses unison detune, turn down the phase randomization to 0 on both oscillators. Doing that will make the synth sound exactly the same every time you play a note. If the oscillator A was louder, this small adjustment would be even more important. In the effects tab, I use a low pass filter. Removing all the high end will make the bassline as smooth as I need. Outside of Serum, I only adjust the volume and equalize the sound. The equalization controls the balance of low and mid frequencies with shelf filters. Another sound I will use in the breakdown is a drum break, or a set of drum breaks. That I use to make the breakdown more interesting, as I don't plan to use here my Schranz kick a lot or percussion. Without drum breaks I could only play with synthesizers and vocal chops, and that was not enough. The drum breaks are processed and layered, just like the drum breaks we used to create the main Schranz percussion. I started with the first break. That had a bit too powerful snare, but I still liked the break as a whole. Instead of using another sample, I experimented with pitching down the sample that made the break less sharp and the snare less punchy. The first break is pitched down by a whole octave, so now adding any other one with no changes to the pitch should give an interesting combination. This reminds a bit of what we did with synthesizers, where each oscillator was an octave higher or lower in relation to the other one, but here in case of the drum breaks, pitching down the first sample wasn't intentional. The second break sounds like this. And if you heard in that break some glitchings, then be sure they come from warping. Without it, the break would sound natural, but it would be out of sync. Using warping here is mandatory. The third break is also unique. It's not pitched down like the first break and has a different type of percussion sounds than the second break. All three breaks sound together like this. Depending on whether you want a fuller, more rhythmic break or not, you can add one extra break or you can use only 2 drum breaks. I don't need an intense sound. In my opinion, 3 loops are enough. These loops could play in such rhythm, but I went the extra mile and chopped the breaks to arrange a different rhythm. The way I did that is different than what we did with the vocal chops, so pay attention. Once every setting is adjusted, the pitch, warping and so on, I switched the simpler mode to slice. The menu on the bottom of the plug window decides how the sample gets chopped. Most likely, you will want to chop the break into equal slices so you can arrange them however you want. Personally, I recommend these settings. Once you are ready, right-click the waveform and choose the Slice to New MIDI track option. This will create a new drum rack channel where each slice of the break is arranged now in the MIDI clip. Each slice of the chopped break is a separate simpler instrument inside of the drum rack, but don't even think of changing the pitch or tweaking the warping settings for each slice individually. This would be too painful even for someone like me. Once I fine-tuned the volume of each drum break, I group all of them to add group processing. At first, drum breaks need to sound lighter. They will all get high-passed inside the Pro Q. After that, I add a tiny bit of distortion with roar. While I don't plan on adding any crunch or fuzz to the drum breaks, the breaks would benefit from slight gluing. That's why the amount of distortion is so little. The most important effect for the drum breaks is the reverb. Once again, I use here the audio effect track, and once again I use the SSL native flex verb that works great on drums. The settings are also identical to what you saw in the percussion one-shot sound. Remaining processing consists of subtle equalization and volume adjustment, but when it comes to the sound design of this break, it's fully finished. The last 2 sounds I want to make are the riser and the downlifter. These sounds can be used to build more tension before the drop, or you can use them from time to time if you feel like the track starts to sound boring. I noticed that Noise Not War makes such sounds out of reverb that was previously added on other sounds. This is my favorite approach as well. I will use the reverb from the SSL native flex verb. I have it on 2 different sounds, the drum break and the percussion one-shot. The flex verb plugin has an infinite switch. If I click it once the reverb is playing, the plugin will freeze the reverb infinitely. We will record this reverb in a second. To stop the reverb from being frozen, use the second button below. To record the reverb onto a new track, create a new audio channel and stretch it to show more options. Instead of the external input, choose the resampling option. Hit the arm recording button and solo both the audio channel and sounds you want to record. In our case, I want to record the frozen reverb, so I solo the drum break group. I hit record and played the breaks for just a second. I hit the infinite button in the SSL reverb and wait until drum breaks stop playing. My frozen reverb I made earlier will sound slightly different. But that's because I hit the infinite switch in a different moment. I want to create a lo-fi style sound, so the first thing that you should think about is using a bit crusher plugin. My recommendation is the D16 Decimode 2. Inside of that plugin, I start with lowering the sample rate, which is the most characteristic effect of using a bit crusher. Then, to add a pleasant fuzz, I turn up the jitter. For additional drive and distortion, I can turn up the preamp. And just to bypass the quantizer section that could add more noise, which I don't need, I turn up the resolution to, I guess, infinity and turn off the DC shift. A downlifter sound effect needs to fade away in some way. I experimented here with the frequency deviation knob that I think gives a more interesting sound than just using a low pass filter. This is what I will use to make the sound fade away, so let's automate this knob in Ableton. The roar effect will add extra fuzz to the sound. If I play for a second the breakdown with all the sounds along with the downlifter, you will understand that the downlifter is barely hearable. Turning the volume up would fill the beat with too many mid-frequencies and the sound would be still boring. Distortion makes sure the downlifter is audible, plus it sounds great. After the roar, I add a rhythmic volume modulation with Sound Toys Tremolator. I set up the effect like this. At first, I turned the depth all the way up. Then, I adjust the rhythm. It will depend on the modulation speed, the shape, and both groove and feel. I recommend to tweak these last two knobs with the metronome playing in the background. The accent knob makes the tremolo sound inconsistent, so I usually leave this untouched. This plugin has some advanced settings that open after clicking the tweak button. I made in that section 2 or 3 small adjustments, but I won't cover them. If you want to learn more about the tremolator, I will be happy if you read the plugin manual. At last, I readjusted the depth to make the modulation less intense. This is what does the tremolo sound like in the end. I don't like how heavy in the low end the downlifter is. The Pro Q that comes after tremolo will remove all the low end from the sound, and remaining filters will tame some harsh frequencies that were added with distortion. At last, to fade out the downlifter better, I add an extra volume modulation. The riser, just like the downlifter, can have a volume automation as well. Because it's the riser sound effect, now the volume goes up in time. To make the riser sound similar to the downlifter, I decided to use distortion again. The riser will be also made from reverb. This recording comes from me using the Serum's reverb from the main lead on the vocal chops. I pasted here for a second the audio effect track, I soloed the reverb chain and recorded the output. The riser has an automated high-pass filter added. This large filter resonance will make the frequency sweep much more interesting. Here is the comparison. You could hear that when the filter had lots of resonance, the frequency sweep sounded more aggressive, but by the end of the sound, I didn't want to hear high frequencies being cut out so aggressively That's why I decided to automate the filter resonance as well. The riser, just like the downlifter, can have a volume automation as well. Because it's the riser sound effect, now the volume goes up in time. To make the riser sound similar to the downlifter, I decided to use distortion again. I didn't want any lo-fi effects though, so instead of the Decimode 2, I used the Decapitator by Sound Toys. If you compare the interface of the Decapitator to the amp effect from Ableton, you will see lots of similarities. The E-distortion style gave me here the kind of fuzz I needed. The only thing to do was to set the amount of distortion and compensate that volume difference with output. The EQ section in the middle works too intense in my opinion, and because I usually equalize the sound afterwards, I don't touch these knobs in the Decapitator. I add extra gain, and in the Pro Q, I use again a combination of both high and low pass filters, for the same reason as with the downlifter sound effect. Trance producers often struggle with making interesting glitch sound effects or short breaks / transitions in the kick drum and percussion. These transitions or breaks can sound like this. I will start the arrangement section of this tutorial with giving you ideas for these transitions, as they play a surprisingly large part of arranging a Schranz track. In my track, I used a combination of 3 effects: Ableton's beat repeat, the reverser module from the ill-formed Glitch 2 plugin, and simple high and low pass filter automations. I would recommend using any of these effects in the group of both kick drum, rumble and percussion, because that's where these effects will have the biggest impact. Let's see first how to use the beat repeat effect. It's an effect that rhythmically captures a part of the beat and plays it in a loop for a certain time. By default, that loop part of the beat is played on top with the dry sound, and that's because of the mix setting here. Set this option to inset, so at any moment we hear either the dry beat or the loop part of it. The black window shows what part of the beat gets captured and repeated. Right now, the interval is set to 1 bar, so the beat repeat effect will begin a new cycle of capturing and looping the sound every single bar. On the bottom of the black window, you can see how the bar is divided into 4 beats. Lowering the interval will make the beat repeat work more frequently. Right now, there are 7 yellow rectangles and only 1 grey rectangle. This tells for how long during the interval a sound is looped. If I want the looped part of the beat to last shorter, turn down the gate knob. If I want the beat repeat effect to take and repeat a different slice of the beat, tweak the offset knob. The slice itself can be longer or shorter, and that depends on the grid setting. Beat repeat has a few settings that make the effect less predictable and more random. Other settings can make the repeated slices fade away in time or gradually lower in pitch. But for the glitchy breaks for Schranz, the settings I've already explained are completely enough. The second effect is the reverser module from the Glitch 2 plugin. This plugin is a collection of effects you can launch and sequence as if you were making a MIDI melody. Among delays, gate effects and lo-fi stuff, I want to show you today the reverser module that I think is most useful. Let's get rid of that complex sequence at first by clicking the init button. On the empty sequence, I add a note in the reverser effect. The settings for this module are now on the bottom. I will set the timing to even to avoid triplet and dot times that I don't hear in Schranz often. Now the time setting, just a bit like in the beat repeat effect, will tell how often a sliced part of the beat that gets reversed will be played around. The point A and B precisely adjust what slice of the beat will be reversed. Other useful options are in the sequence tab. If I need, I can make the sequence longer, or I can increase the grid size if I need to write a more precise sequence. You can also add along a filter once the effect is active with this small filter section in the effect settings. But personally, I prefer to use a separate plugin for that. The third effect that I like to use for transitions are fast, high and low pass filter automations with large filter resonance. That filter resonance, as you've seen earlier when I made the riser sound effect, is crucial, and here on kick and percussion sounds it's going to be even more useful. I did say that these three effects have most impact when used on the whole kick, rumble and percussion group, but if you need from time to time a more subtle effect, feel free to use these effects or only the kick and rumble or only on the percussion. In my project, I have two different glitch plugins with different settings for the reverser effect. I also have the beat repeat effect and a set of low and high pass filters. The kick and rumble group will just use from time to time a low pass filter. I keep using the EQ8 for this automation because for some reason filter sweeps sounded just a tiny bit fatter in the EQ8 than in the Pro Q4 plugin. The whole percussion group will also have a low pass filter as well as a separate glitch 2 plugin. I heavily recommend to rename the EQ8 effects to more suggestive names so you know they are used for transitions and breaks, because after setting up all the effects you want to turn them on and off with automations. Right now you can see all automations that I can draw to make my Schranz transitions. I can turn on and off both beat repeat and glitch 2 effects, as well as EQ8 equalizers. Filters will unfortunately require a few more automations, so you can sweep high and low pass filters. The job is to play around with automations to find an interesting sound. For example, the first transition is mostly about using a high pass filter with a small amount of glitch 2 at the end that's added to the kick, rumble and percussion. The second glitch effect only turns on the glitch 2 plugin that is added only to the percussion group. The third transition combines automations with a slight variations in the drum pattern. The kick drum can be played more or less often. I can also remove the rumble for a second, which also sounds great. Each break or transition like that has its own name and a different color of the MIDI clip. The idea is to create 3 or 4 unique transitions and later use them throughout the whole arrangement. Hide all automations. To do that, make sure the computer MIDI keyboard is off and hit A on your keyboard. Select all MIDI clips and automations on top and copy and paste the automated drum pattern whenever you want. For quote-unquote special moments in the track arrangement, for example when I'm right before the drop or whenever I want to add a new instrument, I have a unique transition or MIDI clip with automations. This clip is 4 bars long, and on top of automations, I also add a claps build-up that go hand in hand. Coloring those MIDI clips also lets me show you now how many of those transitions and glitches I'm using throughout the whole track. This is a very important part of Schranz arrangement that will keep the percussion interesting even if you play throughout the whole track more or less the same drum pattern. Another thing you can hear often in Schranz is that the percussion suddenly gets louder from time to time, especially when the rumble stops playing. Look at one of my short glitch transitions where I have 2 extra automations on the whoosh sound. By the end of the MIDI clip, the last whoosh is going to get louder thanks to a simple utility automation. But through trial and error, I also discovered that it sounds interesting when I turn off the Filter Freak plugin so the whoosh becomes more noisy for a second. I will disable now the automations and give you a listen to the whoosh sound in solo. And now with the remaining sounds. I also have plenty of automations on the main lead sound, but it will be easier to explain them as I go through the whole track structure. I will have a few words to say about it, as the track is 6 minutes long, which is for today's standards extremely long. Intros in Schranz tracks are short and simple. Most likely you will want to play here the basic percussion pattern, so the kick, rumble, whoosh and a few percussion sounds without claps and rides, with a high-pass filter. I rarely hear in intros synthesizers or vocals already playing, so if I have only the percussion to show, it's understandable that the intro will be only 8 bars long. Who would want to listen to that for 16 or 32 bars? By the end of the intro, I use that long transition you've seen earlier with a high-pass filter sweep and clap sounds build up. To make the drop stronger, I'm using the same automations on the master track as in my VZASPAC style track. I'm talking about making the intro a bit quieter and narrower in the stereo fields than the main part of the track. That's a simple trick I use in all of my projects. The next 16 bars just play the basic kick and percussion pattern with no high-pass filter. Once again, in this part of the track I don't add any synths or vocals. I want the listener to know what does the percussion and kick sound like. Do not make that part of the track boring, I rely on those short, glitchy transitions I taught you making earlier. The next 16 bars play the same beat with a percussion one-shot sound effect added. I try to use here different set of glitchy transitions to make the track less repetitive. By the end of that part of the arrangement, we will be listening to just the kick and percussion for a minute. It's the right time to start making things exciting. That's why the last 4 bars will play the MIDI pattern with the snare build-up, along with the riser sound effect. You could also hear some bits of vocal chops during the clap build-up. In that way, I'm giving out that the next part of the arrangement will play vocal chops. Of course, it would sound weird if in the build-up I play vocal chops just not to play them after the build-up. There are a few things that happen here at the same time. At first, the vocal chops are playing with a simpler pattern. There are 2 reasons for that. The first one is that playing a full vocal pattern would ramp up the energy of the track too fast and too high. The second one is that I want to create a nice call and response flow. Just a quick reminder, a call and response is a rhythm where 2 different sounds take turns, just like the kick and snare in drum and bass. The sounds that take turns are the vocal chops, claps that I've just added, and the percussion one shot you could hear earlier. If you listen to the beat, you will notice that these 3 sounds almost never play at the same time. Each sound has its own timing. By the way, with each sound added in the percussion, the color of the MIDI clip shifts from green, where I have the least energy, to red, where I play every percussion sound. I made that so you can easier see how I control the power of the track. That coloring applies to all other sounds in the track, including the main lead that starts to play early in the track. And you might ask if it's appropriate to play the main lead of the track so early. If I played here the lead sound with all the effects that are supposed to make the lead sound big and heavy, then I think it would be inappropriate. But as I said, the main lead has plenty of automations that have a certain purpose. That purpose is to make the lead sound weaker and less interesting. It's true that I played the lead early on, but in that part of the track, the lead is playing with only 1 oscillator. Less oscillators mean a less full sound. In the audio effect track, I keep the delay off. If I change the automation and add the delay later in the track, it will also help making the lead more interesting. But in this moment, the lead sounds like this. Those automations explain why I let myself play the main lead so early. Now, here comes another interesting thing. If I use a few automations to make the lead less powerful, then throughout the track I can tweak each automation one by one to slowly turn up the amount of energy in the arrangement. And this is a key part of this track structure. Soon after you know what does the simple main lead sound like, I arrange a short breakdown that begins with rolling off the high end from the percussion. In the breakdown, I fade out the vocals to give the lead more space. It's going to need it, because through the automation I slowly add another oscillator in the lead. To create some sense of a drop, I mess around with the volume envelope. Thanks to that, the lead becomes more and more plucky, but again, that's just to make the build-up more interesting. We could call this a small drop. If so, then I can tweak the automations I have on the master channel again to make that small drop more powerful. Another small thing that makes the drop stronger is turning down the volume of the lead right before it. You see, in that short moment of silence we can hear only the reverb coming from the lead. If I add a small fade out here, the volume difference between a quiet breakdown and loud drop will be even bigger. So, this further makes the drop stronger. The second drop is 32 bars long, where I play the main lead and almost full percussion pattern. Right after the first drop, I had a 16 bars long section that was supposed to get you familiar with the sound of the kick, rumble and percussion. Those 32 bars here are to get you familiar with how does the main lead sound like, more or less. The listener doesn't know that the lead will get even fuller later. Again, I use glitchy transitions to keep the track interesting, and by the end, I start to use more automations, mainly to fade out the main lead to prepare for the main breakdown. The main breakdown, just like in the Radio Freak track that was my main reference, is going to be a calm part of the track, where I have enough space to show how melodic and emotional the main lead is. Until the build-up that will lead to the main drop, I will not play the Schranz kick drum or percussion. I start with playing just the main lead, but very soon I add that simple bass line to fill the breakdown with the low end. I can imagine the low frequencies of this bass working great in a club with massive speakers. The bass makes the breakdown more interesting, but at the same time, the sound is so smooth it doesn't take away the attention from the main lead. In that moment, I also add the delay to the lead to make it fuller. Let's play the beat for a bit longer, and in the moment where I feel the arrangement gets boring again, I am adding more sounds. It's the first time and last time where I will use those layered drum breaks in the track. To give that part of the breakdown more emphasis, I added a riser before and a downlifter after I start playing drum breaks. These two sounds give a strong signal that this part of the breakdown is important and that we will slowly turn up the energy. So, let's do it and play the full vocal pattern as well. In that moment, I add the oscillator C to the synthesizer, so this gives the sound a little impact. The oscillator C was very quiet anyways. How to transition from the breakdown to build up? I suggest to start with a strong accent, that is using the main Schranz kick. At first, I play the kick without rumble, but very soon I add the rumble as well. I will let the main lead play for a little longer, but you can be sure that by the end of the build-up, the lead sound will fade out again. I'm doing that mainly with a low-pass filter that will be used on the main kick drum and rumble as well. Using a low-pass filter in a similar way on the simple bass line wouldn't work because the bass covers a little frequency range. A frequency sweep with a low-pass filter would not be hearable for most of the time. That's why instead I just stop playing the bass. I think this also gives a clear signal that something will happen soon. The same thing happens to the breaks and vocals, but notice that each of these three sounds stop playing at different moments in the track. In my opinion, this is more interesting than removing all the sounds at the same moment. All the automations, including those on the master channel, and patterns are explained, so let's listen how does everything create a strong drop. Let's discuss the main drop. What is obvious is that I play here a full kick and rumble pattern, and all percussion sounds are throw and for maximum energy. I can keep up this energy for as long as I don't find it boring. Even with the glitchy transitions that I still use, I decided to make the most exciting part of the track 32 bars long, which translates to 50 seconds. Glitchy effects on percussion let me play the main lead completely uninterrupted. Imagine how chaotic the track would be if I add some beat repeat or glitch 2 automation on both the percussion and the main lead. An interesting sound here is the Reese bass that has the same bassline as the simple bass from the main breakdown. Honestly, the only purpose of the Reese here is to make the drop stronger. When I was making this track and arranging it, I didn't plan to use a Reese bass at all. Unfortunately, without it, I was thinking the main drop is not strong enough. Let me show you how less powerful the track is without that Reese bass. At this moment, I came up with an idea to add here for a short moment that Reese bass. It's an universal sound that is used in Schranz a lot. Since the Reese is used only to make the second drop stronger, you can understand now why I don't use it anywhere else. The mix in that part is crowded. If I tried to add vocal chops to the main lead, not only it would take away the attention from the main lead, but also both sounds would clash, making the mixdown more difficult. The most exciting part of the track ends with most of the sounds fading out through a low-pass filter. To fade out the lead in a more original way, instead of using a low-pass filter here, I use once again the automations to turn off some of the oscillators and to make the lead quieter. To hear better that lead sound getting weaker, I made sure to mute everything else around. The next part of the track will have less energy, and this means I won't be using the lead anymore. If you think of it, the lead sound was used in large majority of the arrangement, so here, instead of the lead, why not to play the vocal chops with full pattern? There won't be any other sound that will distract from you listening to the vocal chops. To further remove the energy from the beat, I also use a less aggressive percussion pattern. The last 16 bars of the arrangement are all more or less the same thing as the beat right after the first drop. I use here a basic percussion pattern, the kick with rumble, and that's it. To make the transition smoother, I added a downlifter sound effect. By the end of those 16 bars, I add back a high-pass filter, and everything gets cut aggressively, marking the end of the whole track. And this kind of arrangement, where I play the drums until the very end of the track, is very DJ friendly. If you as a DJ would like to play this track and the main part of it with the main lead, notice that from the moment where the lead gets removed, the track will keep playing for only a single minute. Unless you have prepared the transition earlier, you set up the cue points, loaded up the track B or whatever, a single minute to switch from the track A to track B can be a problem for some. Playing the drums until the very end gives the DJ a possibility to loop the last section of the track to keep the track playing for longer if he or she needs more time to make a good transition to another track. Just like in the previous tutorial, in the Mixdown part of this video I will focus on just the biggest challenges. It won't be a surprise if I say that I struggled most with two things: making the rumble sound full and cleaning up the percussion from harsh resonances while gluing everything together. I will show you how to do each of these things while working on the basic kick and percussion pattern without claps and rides playing along. That's because it's easy to cover an imperfect mix by just slapping on more sounds to drive the attention from the empty mix away. A properly mixed Schranz track should sound full right from the first drop, where there are no synths, claps, rides, and so on. Right after arranging the track, my kick and percussion sounded like that. The kick drum was already layered and the rumble had the decapitator effect running. And even though this decapitator already changes the sound of the rumble a lot, that's far away from a typical noise not war track. the easiest way to show you how far we are from the desired result is using a low-pass filter on the master channel and listening to our mix while comparing it to the reference. You can easily hear that my rumble is too rhythmic and it bounces off too much. I did already mention in the sound design part of this video that to fix that the rumble was distorted multiple times. So once again, let's play the whole kick and rumble, this time with the percussion, and turn on extra distortion on rumble I added later. At first, without a low pass filter. The rumble gets a lot of crunch, and now you might think that this is too aggressive, but remember that the high end from the rumble can be always cut with a low pass filter, and our main goal of using saturation was to make the low end fuller. I will show you again how does the distortion change the mix, this time with a low pass filter. That's the secret for a full rumble sound. After saturating the rumble so much, you can definitely say the kick is not punchy enough. If you used good kick samples, fixing that will be easy. At first, make sure the kick is loud enough. What usually happens is that you add the kick that seems to be loud enough because it plays along with rumble and nothing more, but then you add the vocals, synths and percussion while forgetting about adjusting the kick volume. Here, I started with turning up the whole kick by 6 decibels. If I turn on the low pass filter, you will hear the punch much better now. This might sound simple, but I want you to pay attention to that, because apart from the volume adjustment, there's only one trick that will help you much with the kick punch. That trick is boosting the 100 Hz frequency range in the kick. Most kicks will benefit from such an equalization, as the 80 to around 150 Hz frequency range is the range where the kick is most powerful and punchy in the beginning. In my kick, I used a Trident A-range equalizer with a shelf filter that boosts by roughly 3 decibels everything below 100 Hz. The last thing you can try to make the kick more punchy and round is to saturate the kick. On my main kick sound, I have 2 distortion effects that make the kick sit better in the mix. I will turn both of them at the same time because the difference in sound is small. Noise not work kicks are clean, that's why to achieve the necessary punch I had to rely more on the low end boost and volume adjustment than on the saturation. If I wanted my kick to sound like in the Triptych's Texas Bastard track that I remade from scratch in another tutorial but for FL Studio, the proportions can be different, meaning I would use more saturation than low end boost in the EQ. Remaining kick equalization includes a small cut at 700 Hz for a cleaner sound. To give the kick more click in the transient part of it, I'm using these 2 filters. They should target the frequency range from 7 kHz upwards. Later, I readjust the volume and stereo widths of the kick. After making the rumble slightly more narrow, I start gluing the kick with rumble. For that, I use a tiny bit of glue compression. It's used mostly to help fill that short gap in the moment where the kick stops playing and rumble starts to come in. Notice the dry wet set to 25%. If I turn this knob all the way up, the kick drum will not be much louder than the rumble. In theory, you would say this makes the kick and rumble more glued, but what we sacrifice instead is all of the kick punch because of too much compression. The equalization that follows the glue compressor is subtle. If I turn on these 3 plugins together, what you will hear mostly is that the kick gets warmer because of a small 100 Hz boost, and that the transient is less bright because of the high-end cuts. Another big part of making the kick and rumble sound full is clipping. Out of a few clipper plugins I have, the standard clip by SIR Audio Tools is something I use most often. I taught you using this plugin in the VZSPAC full track tutorial, where clipping the kick was even more important, so if you don't know what clipping is or how to use this plugin, go check this video out. Here I will state that the Schranz kick needs way more low-end punch than the VZSPAC kick, so when I turn on the effect on and off, you will hear less glue, but that's okay, because the goal is to keep the punch in the kick. All these adjustments will result in a full low-end sound. I'm going to turn on a low-pass filter on the master channel and compare again my mix to the noise not word track. The second challenge was cleaning up the percussion and gluing everything together. I will talk about these two problems at the same time because gluing the percussion can be interpreted differently and I want to make sure to explain something. Most of the times when producers talk about gluing the percussion to the kick or about just gluing the percussion, they mean a full kick and percussion sound that flows well. This effect and this kind of sound in Schranz doesn't depend that much on the group processing. With the percussion I already have, let me show you what happens to the sound if I try to just glue it in a way most people think of, by using saturation on the group of the kick and percussion. What happens now is that the rumble got even more harmonics and crunch, but the hi-hats and percussion started to drown in the mix. Using less distortion doesn't give the desired effect of a fuller sound. What's the real answer to that glue I mentioned a minute ago is a rich and noisy percussion. My percussion, even though it has a few loops playing, is too empty. In between the hi-hats there is nothing that fills the beat. That's why when I add the kick and rumble, the beat is not driving enough. To make you understand that better, I will use now a high-pass filter on the master channel and compare my mix to the reference track. A rich percussion sound that, as a result, gives a feeling of a glue is a result of layering multiple noise sounds on top. This is what I already showed you making in the sound design part of the video, but I thought that back then the purpose of these noise layers wasn't clear enough. So now, with the kick and rumble playing, I will return to the percussion loops parallel processing and turn on the processing again. At first, the dry chain, where I decided later to add the pedal effect. Not only the pedal effect is responsible for a fuller sound, the equalizers that come after, especially the Soundtoys SI-EQ, add a significant boost in the high ends and mid-range, making the percussion even more noisy. The second processing chain, called noise, takes care of the mid-range. And the compression chain that uses that aggressive devil lock compressor for more brightness. These noise layers are the most important for the percussion. Besides them, I have a few also much smaller tweaks that will refine the percussion, but right now the next thing that will give the sound most impact is proper equalization. When it comes to that, I prefer a top-down approach where I equalize at first groups of sounds to later work with individual sounds. The perc group has both the whoosh and percussion samples. This is where I start. At first, I want to make the percussion feel more alive. Right now, all sounds are a bit lifeless. This usually suggests a lack of frequencies at around 1 kHz. The SI-EQ added here will take care of that, and I will also give a boost to the highest frequencies. After that, the Trident A range cuts the so-called air in the percussion that sits at roughly 12 kHz and above. The Pro Q4 that comes after has two important assignments: to precisely remove the low end that could clash with the kick and rumble, and to clean the percussion from low hiss resonances. There are roughly in the frequency range from 1.5 to 3.5 kHz. It will be best if I play the percussion and toggle the most important filters on and off so you can understand what does change in the sound. Another Pro Q4 boosts the high end but only on the sides. The mid-side equalization that you can see here is a really small cherry on top. If you have less than, I would say, 3 years of music production experience, there is no need to learn about mid-side EQ yet. It's not gatekeeping, but making sure you don't obsess over the tiniest details when you still can improve the basics. At last, this small clipper will start shaving the peaks to prepare the mix for loudness. It's set in a way that unless the claps and rides don't play, the clipper doesn't change at all the sound. And even if the claps and rides were playing, I made sure that this clipper won't destroy the transients of percussion. Of course, because a lot of limiting and distortion, we don't have a lot of them anyways. The perc group is processed, so now let's get down to the loops plus hi-hats. I will skip discussing the whoosh sound equalization, because I've already explained that massive high shelf boost in the Pro Q. The rest of EQ adjustments are so tiny that it makes no sense to try to explain them. We could say almost the same thing about the equalization of this whole channel. Apart from two utilities that set the volume and stereo widths, the soft tube equalizer boosts a frequency range useful for shiny percussion sound. I'm talking about the 7 kHz boost. This EQ also emphasizes lower mid-range to give the percussion more definition. And that's the magic of the top-down approach. Equalizing at first the whole percussion group will give you roughly 70% of the whole result, that is a clean percussion. Remaining 30% comes from equalizing either smaller groups of percussive sounds or just individual sounds. The next big group of sounds are the percussion loops after the audio effect track. This Pro Q4 will take care of all these chains and noise layers I made earlier. In the middle of mixing the track, I noticed that I couldn't hear the loops well on the main drop where all sounds were playing. So at first I turned up the volume a lot, but then I heard too much dirt in the percussion. A solution was to cut the mud out of the loops that was mostly at around 300 Hz. All the sounds from the basic percussion pattern are treated as well. Let's move on to the remaining sounds. The percussion one-shot that had a short reverb that I couldn't hear well in the mix, despite setting the reverb volume pretty high. That's why before any equalization, I used the Brainworks opto compressor that helped glue in both one-shot and reverb. After that, the Pro Q4 just has a small shelf boost, followed by a tiny bit of extra pumping with the LFO tool. Again, very small adjustments. Ride samples are an interesting sound to equalize. If you listen to a lot of Schranz, you might already know that ride samples are one of the loudest sounds in those tracks. If those sounds have too much air, or if they aren't bright enough, they won't make the beat driving much. Usually when I equalize the rides, I use a low-pass filter to tame the air in the sound. I know, a low-pass filter usually removes some of the high frequencies completely, but when I equalize rides, I not only use a gentle low-pass filter, I also set the cutoff to around 18 kHz, so the filter really just tames those airy frequencies. To brighten the rides, I try to boost 5 kHz areas. 2 kHz cut removes unpleasant, low-pitched hiss from the sound. This is also a frequency range I tame a lot whenever I'm making an industrial kick drum. Cutting the 2 kHz area is one of the best ways to make a track sound clean. The equalization of claps was covered in the sound design part of this tutorial, and the closed hi-hat didn't require any equalization. After all, the closed hi-hat is tiny. At this point, I have enough noise layers for a full percussion sound, and everything about the kick, rumble and percussion is equalized. Now that's the moment where I can try to glue everything in the kick plus percussion group. But after all careful processing, you might realize that now you don't need that much to make the beat sound perfect. And that's what I was talking about. You can't get a full mix by just grouping everything together and slapping some distortion, clipping or whatever. The first effect that will glue the sound is the roar. Notice that the tri-wet is set to 16%. I mix the effect subtly because there isn't that much to do in the group processing here. I will play you the beat and turn up the tri-wet for a while so you can understand what kind of crunch I'm adding. You can also imagine how I would destroy the mix if I didn't turn down the tri-wet that much. This effect, when mixed in properly, gives such a difference in sound. After the roar, I'm using the G-clip clipper that will cut peaks from the waveform and prepare the mix for loudness during mastering. I try to set the amount of clipping as low as possible without touching the transient and attack of the kick drum audibly. I was surprised to discover that I didn't need to do much when mastering this track. I think that's because 80% of the Schranz track is just the kick drum and intense rumble and percussion. As you saw in the Mixdown part of the video, I put an enormous amount of processing to get these sounds right, but it doesn't mean there isn't anything that I don't want to fix during mastering. When I compared my mix to reference tracks, I noticed that my beat sounds too crispy. It also sounds a bit too warm, with less low end than it should have. I would say that the reason for a too crispy mix lies mostly in the distorted and harsh percussion loops, being either distorted too much or not equalized enough. The excess of warmth might come from rumble that's processed too aggressively. The lack of low end would be directly related to the way I equalize the rumble. However, these problems can be easily solved with an equalizer. I gave the Black Box analog design HGQ a test ride. The Black Box plugin series made by Brainworks is something I've seen being praised often by mix and mastering engineers. However, those people were mainly glazing the HG2 and HG2MS saturation effects, while not giving the HGQ a lot of attention. Personally, I didn't find this equalizer to be very useful either, but you could say that I'm not skilled enough to use the full potential of such tools. Anyways, I still set up this EQ to fix all the problems I have mentioned a minute ago. The lack of low end, the excess of warmth, and a sound that is too crispy. After equalization, I took care of the stereo image. If you remember my VCS full track tutorial, you remember me saying that it's a standard thing to make the high end wider to emphasize in a track screeches or hi-hats more. So why one of the bands that touches the high end as well gets more narrow? The answer lies in the way I made the percussion. Throughout the project, I was using a lot of distortion in many places when processing the percussion loops, claps, hi-hats and so on. Because of that, I have been building up a lot of harshness and noise in both mid-range and high-end. Most of that harsh sound was cut during equalization in the mix, but when equalizing over 5 different percussion sounds that are extremely distorted, it's rare to pull off every processing perfectly. I could try to return to my Mixdown project to tame harsh frequencies in gain equalizes more. In the Mixdown I could also make some of the percussion sounds more narrow in the stereo field, but thankfully I was able to fix that with just a single fader. Listen to how does the mix gets cleaner while I turn this band on and off. The fourth band gets the width increased. In context of what I said right now, this can be confusing, so let me explain. This band precisely targets just the right sound in the track. If you remember the right sounds equalization, you will remember me making most of the adjustments at around 8 kHz, because that's the frequency range right sounds can dominate. From 8 kHz upwards, there isn't as much fuzz or noise as in the mid-range that I made more narrow. So, increasing the width of the highest frequencies will push the rights in the mix more, but it won't emphasize the harshness I was reducing with both ozone imager and the black box EQ. The Pro Q4 afterwards further cleans the mix from some noises that prevent the mix from being clean. A single band was enough to take care of all frequency related problems I could hear. And now I'm ready for increasing the loudness. This is something I have to do with a limiter. Using a clipper could potentially add unwanted crunch and distortion, which is something I want to avoid. After all, what I just did in the black box EQ was making the track less crunchy. Thankfully, because of the kick drum and percussion that, as you can see here, is aggressively clipped, a right limiter should be able to push the loudness easily. Clipping effects were added during Mixdown in quite many places. In the Mixdown project I have a clipper on the kick plus percussion group, the kick plus rumble group. On the rumble itself, also I didn't use this clipper to remove the picks, but rather to color the rumble in a certain way, on the percussion group, and probably on a few more places, including the main lead synth. But the most important will be the clipper effects that treat either the kick drum, rumble or percussion. What limiter will be right for this track? My first choice was the Vintage Limiter by Ozone 9. The analog mode sounded very transparent and was not destroying much transients coming from the kick drum or clap sounds. I set up this limiter when listening to the most exciting and intense part of this track, and when I turn on and off the limiter here, the track seems to sound okay. I will do that right now with the gain match on. This feature will let you hear only the difference in the transients and dynamics without an extreme difference in loudness. This helps hearing more how quote-unquote harmful a limiter is. But this vintage limiter had one little problem. It added slight warmth. That was something that, again, I wanted to avoid. The black box EQ already has a cut at around 200 Hz to clean up the mix. Another plugin I tried was the BX limiter by Brainworks. I like a lot, but I felt that limiter was adding to the sound slight amounts of crisp. Even if I am right about that, this doesn't mean that this limiter is bad and should never be used. This time I just needed something as transparent as possible. Because of that, I decided to use instead the Pro L2 limiter by FabFilter. Thanks to various limiting styles, I was able to find a more transparent sound that wasn't making the mix warmer or more crispy. The attack and release was tweaked in a purely subjective way to find a rhythm that felt best for me, and that is the limiter I will use in the end. To make the mastering part of this video even more valuable, I exported 3 different masters to show differences between the limiters. Each of them was set up to end up with the peak volume of -0.2 dB and around -5.5 of short-term LUFS. If you want to know more about increasing the loudness and how to utilize the potential of both limiter and clipper plugins, watch now this short tutorial that explains the differences between these two types of effects and shows how to use them both on hard and industrial techno kicks.